Mewtwo is the most powerful Pokemon ever created, but power was never his real problem. His real problem was purpose. Because what do you do when the world tells you what you are for, and it feels nothing like who you are? That question doesn't stay in a movie, it shows up in real life. When you build a career that looks right, follows a path that makes sense, and still feels like something is off. Mewtwo didn't choose his existence, he was engineered. Designed with intention, given a role before he ever had a voice to question it. There's an old idea that says, before I formed you, I knew you. But Mewtwo was created by people trying to play God, with no understanding of what they were bringing into the world. This is Disassembled Heroes and Villains, and today, we explore Mewtwo, and why purpose isn't something you're given, it's something you have to choose. Mewtwo's story doesn't begin with a choice. It begins with a decision someone else already made for him. And if we're honest, that's where a lot of people start too. In a laboratory, deep beneath the surface, scientists attempt something they were never meant to control. They take the DNA of a legendary Pokemon, Mew, and begin to replicate it. Not to understand it, not to preserve it, but to improve it. To create something stronger, more powerful, more useful, and eventually, that experiment opens its eyes. Mewtwo awakens. Not into a world, but into containment. Not into freedom, but into observation. Glass walls, cold lights, voice speaking about him, but never to him. And in those first moments, something critical begins to form. Not just awareness, identity. Because when someone comes into existence surrounded by control, they don't learn who they are. They learn what they're for. And for Mewtwo, that answer is immediate. A weapon. You could hear it in the way the scientists talk. Measured, clinical, even detached. They don't see a life, they see potential. Power to be studied, power to be directed, power to be used. And over time, Mewtwo begins to believe them, because identity doesn't just come from within, it's shaped, especially early on, by what we're told, what we're shown, and what we're treated as. And if everything around you tells you your value is in what you can do, you start to believe that's all you are. There's no guidance, no relationship, no one asking who he might become, only people deciding what he should be. Scripture tells us an old truth that says, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. It speaks to intention, to value, to being known before being used. But Mewtwo's beginning is the inversion of that idea. He's engineered, not valued, created, not understood. And when identity is built in an environment like that, it doesn't begin in confidence. It begins in resentment. And maybe you felt that. When your value was tied to performance, to output, to what you could provide, not who you actually were. Because underneath all of it, a question starts forming. It's quiet at first, but so dangerous. If I was created for someone else's purpose, do I have one of my own? The question doesn't make Mewtwo dangerous in itself, at least not yet, but it puts him on a path where power feels like the only answer. Because when purpose is imposed instead of chosen, your identity doesn't grow, it fractures. Again and again, until that fracture eventually breaks. When identity is built on control, it doesn't collapse all at once. It fractures. Quietly at first, a question here, a doubt there, and if you ever started questioning the life you're in, you know exactly what that feels like, until eventually, it breaks. And when it does, it rarely looks like clarity, it looks destructive, because Mewtwo doesn't wake up and calmly reject the role he was given. He rejects it the only way he knows how, with destruction. The laboratory doesn't fail. It's completely and utterly destroyed. Glass shatters, machines collapse, the people who created him are erased in the wake of what they unleashed. And in that moment, Mewtwo believes he's free, because the people who defined him are gone. The system that controlled him is broken. The role that was forced onto him has been rejected. But there's a problem. Rejecting what was forced onto you is not the same as discovering who you are. And Mewtwo shows why the distinction matters more and more. Because without a new foundation, identity doesn't disappear, it just defaults. And Mewtwo's default is the only thing he was ever taught, power. So when Giovanni enters the picture, offering direction, purpose, and structure, it feels like something new, but it isn't. Giovanni doesn't see Mewtwo as a living being, he sees him as an asset, a weapon refined, a tool perfected, a borrowed mission keeps you useful and comfortable. And this time, Mewtwo doesn't resist it, because at least now, there's some clarity. At least now, there's a bit of direction, even if that direction still isn't his. But it's a trap, because when purpose is defined by strength alone, it doesn't lead to meaning. It leads to the destruction of oneself, to proving, to controlling, to forcing the world to recognize your value. And maybe you've even felt that pull to achieve more, to prove more, to become something undeniable, just to quiet the question underneath. But control cannot answer the question Mewtwo is actually asking. It can only amplify it, because power on loan is still controlled by someone else. There's a warning that says, do not conform, be transformed. And Mewtwo thinks that's what he's done. He's broken free, taken control, stepped into his power, but he hasn't transformed. He's just shifted from being controlled to becoming the one in control. And deep down, the question hasn't changed. It's just gotten louder. And if I'm not what they made me to be, then who am I? Because until that question is answered, power will always feel like the closest thing to purpose. And that's what makes this part of Mewtwo's story so dangerous. Not because he's strong, but because he's searching and mistaking that control for meaning. When purpose isn't found, it doesn't just disappear, it gets replaced. And if you've ever thrown yourself into something, whether it be a job, a goal, a version of success, just to avoid asking deeper questions, you've seen this happen. And for Mewtwo, that replacement looks like control. Not a form of survival, not some type of freedom, control. Because if power is the only thing that's ever defined your value, then power starts to feel like the only thing that can give your life meaning. So Mewtwo does something that feels at first like growth, like an opportunity. He builds, he creates, he invites trainers to New Island, promising something greater. A test, a challenge, a proving ground, but beneath all of it, something deeper is forming. Mewtwo isn't just gathering opponents, he's building a system. A world where strength determines worth, where superiority decides who deserves to exist. And at the center of it, he places himself, not as a participant, but as the judge, the standard, the answer. Because Mewtwo thinks he's escaped what's been done to him, but in reality, he's just recreating it. It's the same hierarchy, the same control system, the same belief that value is determined by usefulness and power. But only now, he's the one enforcing it. Clones are created, copies of Pokémon, stronger, more aggressive, are stripped of individuality. They're not born, they're engineered, just like he was. And without realizing it, Mewtwo becomes the very thing he hated. Because pain does something dangerous when it's left unchecked. If it's never understood, if it's never processed or ever challenged, it doesn't disappear. It just reshapes and reforms itself, and often, it convinces us that becoming the one in control is the same thing as becoming free, but it isn't. It's just the same system, wearing a different face. There's a question that cuts straight through this moment. What good is it to gain the whole world, yet lose your soul? Because Mewtwo is gaining everything he thought he wanted. Power, control, authority, and maybe you've chased some version of that too. The promotion, the recognition, the life that proved you matter. But none of it answers the question underneath. None of it tells him who he is. And that's that truth about false purpose. It can look like progress. It can look like control. It can even feel like success. But if it's built on the same foundation that broke you, it will never make you whole. And the deeper Mewtwo goes down that path, the more everything begins to fracture, because the world he's creating is starting to look exactly like the one he'd tried to destroy. And once that realization begins to surface, everything changes. The system Mewtwo created was supposed to prove something, that strength determines worth, that power decides who deserves to exist, that the world can only be corrected by force. But when the battle begins, something unexpected happens. It doesn't look like an evolution, it looks like suffering. Pokémon face their own reflections, copies of themselves forced into a conflict they never chose. Blow for blow, strike for strike, there's no strategy, just repetition, pain, mirrored, over and over and over again. And if you ever chased something you thought would fix everything, only to realize it's just creating more damage, this is that same exact moment. Because for the first time, Mewtwo was forced to watch something he didn't anticipate. It's not resistance or defiance. It's shared suffering. The clones feel it, the originals feel it, and suddenly, the line he built his philosophy on begins to collapse. Stronger, weaker, original, copy, none of it matters. They're all hurting, and then Ash steps forward. There's no advantage, there's no way to stop what's coming, he just makes a decision. He walks into the middle of the conflict, no way to win it, only to end it. And in a moment that makes no logical sense, he sacrifices himself, turning to stone as the battle stops around him. And that's the moment that breaks everything. Because Ash doesn't act out of strength. He doesn't act out of a form of defiance. He acts out of something Mewtwo has never understood. Love. Selflessness, sacrifice, but ultimately, love. And maybe this is where it hits you too, because that kind of strength doesn't make sense if power is the only thing that matters. And it exposes something Mewtwo cannot ignore. If humans are only cruel, this moment shouldn't exist. But it does exist, and it forces a question Mewtwo can no longer avoid. What if I was wrong? Because Ash doesn't defeat Mewtwo with a final move. He breaks his worldview. There's a verse in scripture that says, "Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." And standing in the aftermath of that moment, Mewtwo finally sees it. Not some idea, but as something real. Because for the first time in his life, he's confronted with a kind of strength that doesn't dominate, it doesn't control, and it absolutely does not destroy, but it gives. And in that moment, everything Mewtwo believed about purpose begins to collapse. Because if power isn't the answer, then the question he's been trying to solve was never about strength in the first place. It was about something deeper. Something he was never taught. Something he now has to choose. When everything Mewtwo believed collapses, there's a moment where he could rebuild it the same way. Stronger, more controlled, more certain. He could double down, rewrite the rules, reassert dominance, force the world to make sense again. And if you've ever been there, when everything falls apart, you know how tempting that is. To go back to what's familiar, even if it's what broke you. But he doesn't. Because for the first time in his life, Mewtwo hesitates. Not out of some newfound weakness, but out of awareness. Because once you've seen a different kind of strength, you can't unsee it. Ash's sacrifice didn't just interrupt the battle, it gave Mewtwo something he was never given. A choice. Not the kind forced onto him in a lab, not the kind shaped by power or expectation, a real one, and that changes everything. Because up until this moment, every version of Mewtwo's identity has been a reaction. He was created, so he became a weapon. He was controlled, so he rebelled. He was hurt, so he reached for destruction and domination over his opponents. But now, there's no one left to react to. There's no system to destroy, no authority to reject. Only a question: who do I choose to be? And this time, the answer doesn't come from a power trip. It comes from a simple decision. Mewtwo stops the battle, not because he's overpowered, not because he's beaten, but because he no longer believes in what it represents. He looks at the clones, the originals, the humans, and for the first time, he doesn't see categories. He sees lives. And that shift leads to the most important realization of his entire story. I see now that the circumstances of one's birth are irrelevant. It is what you do with the gift of life that determines who you are. That isn't just a conclusion, it's a turning point. Because Mewtwo finally understands something that was never given to him. Purpose isn't something you're assigned, it's something you choose. And that choice comes with a cost. Because once you take responsibility for who you become, you lose the ability to blame what made you. And maybe that's the hardest part. Because it means the lab no longer defines him. The scientist no longer define him. The pain no longer defines him. Only his decisions do. Scripture tells us a command that cuts straight through this moment. Choose this day whom you will serve. Because identity is always built on what you choose to follow. Power, pain, control, or something higher. And Mewtwo makes his decision, not to conquer, not to destroy, not to prove a damn thing, but to leave. To step away from the system he created and search for meaning on his own terms. No need for an audience, or validation, or some guarantee, just freedom. And for the first time, Mewtwo isn't acting like a weapon. He's acting like someone who finally understands that his life is finally the shape. Before we move into the final part of this story, let me ask you something. Are you living out a role, or are you choosing a purpose? Because Mewtwo's journey isn't really about how he was created. It's about what he chose to become after everything that tried to define him. And that moment shows up in real life more often than we expect. When the path you're on looks right, but doesn't feel right. When what's expected of you doesn't match who you're becoming. Those moments don't feel dramatic. They feel quiet, uncomfortable, even easy to ignore. But they're the ones that define you. So if this story is hitting you, if you've ever felt like you were living out a role instead of a purpose, subscribe. because Disassembled Heroes and Villains isn't just about breaking down characters. It's about understanding the ideas behind them, and with those ideas, ask of us. Mewtwo's story doesn't stay on New Island, because the question he's forced to answer is one a lot of men face without realizing it. If you've ever felt like your life looks right on paper, but something still feels off, this is that question. It didn't start in a lab, but in expectations. Because most men aren't engineered in a laboratory, but they are shaped by something else. From an early age, the message is clear. Whether it's spoken or not, it's be useful, be productive, be strong, be dependable, become a provider, a worker, a leader, and those things aren't wrong by themselves. But over time, they can become something else, a definition. Because when your value is measured by what you produce, it becomes easy to confuse your role with your identity, just like Mewtwo did. He wasn't just powerful, he believed power was the reason he existed, and a lot of men fall into that same category, not with the same form of destruction, but with achievement. Build more, earn more, accomplish more. Prove your worth over and over and over and over again. And maybe you felt that pressure to keep going, to keep producing, to never slow down long enough to question it. But no matter how much you build, that question doesn't go away. Is this actually who I am, or just what I've been told to be? Because usefulness is not the same as purpose. You can succeed in every role handed to you and still feel like something is missing. Scripture speaks directly to that tension. What good is it to gain the whole world, yet lose your soul? Because it's possible to win, to succeed, to be respected, and still feel empty. And it's not because you failed, but because you never chose your path. You followed, you performed, you delivered, but you never stopped long enough to ask if the life you were building actually aligned with the man you were becoming. And that's the difference Mewtwo finally understands. He stops asking, what was I made for, and starts asking, what do I choose to become? There's another truth that puts it so simply. Guard your heart, for everything flows from it. Because purpose doesn't come from pressure. It comes from alignment, from choosing a path that reflects your values, not just your capabilities. That choice comes with a cost. It might mean stepping away from expectations, reevaluating what success looks like, letting go of roles that no longer fit you. It might even mean starting over. But that isn't failure, because every meaningful life is shaped the same way Mewtwo's was. Not by what was assigned to it, but by what was chosen. Because in the end, your role can be given, your responsibilities can be defined, your expectations can be set, but your purpose, that's the one thing no one else gets to decide for you. Mewtwo's story doesn't end with power. It doesn't end with a victory. It ends with a simple decision. Because in the beginning, everything about his life was defined for him. What he was capable of, what he was meant to be. And for a long time, he believed it. He believed he was a weapon. He believed power determined worth. He believed the world that created him deserved to be judged. But none of those beliefs were ever really his. They were expectations, given to him before he ever had the chance to question them. And that's what makes his final choice matter. Because Mewtwo doesn't rewrite his past. He doesn't erase what was done to him. He does something harder. He refuses to let it decide who he becomes. And that's the shift that defines his story. He stops asking, why was I created? And starts asking, who will I become? And the truth is, that question comes for everyone eventually. Not in some lab, but in the quieter moments. When the path you're on no longer feels aligned. When success stops feeling like fulfillment. When the life you're building starts to feel disconnected from who you are. Those are the moments that start to define you, not because they're dramatic, but because they force a decision. Follow what was handed to you, or choose something different. There's a promise that says, you are called to be free, not controlled, not defined by your past, not trapped in the roles placed on you, free. But freedom comes with responsibility, because once you realize your life is yours to shape, you can't avoid the question anymore. So what will you choose? This has been Disassembled Heroes and Villains. Stay deliberate, stay aligned, and as always, stay handsome.